Hey everybody, and welcome back to the Dev Marketer channel. Today's video is continuing our Vue.js fundamentals series, and we're looking at part number 9 of the series now. Now, the last video that we did, we talked about computed properties, and hopefully you guys found a lot of value, and there's a lot of information to cover in that video. Now, today's video, part 9, we're going to continue on and just kind of finish up a last few concepts with computed properties that I think will be important for you to understand. And we talked once about at the beginning of the video today. We're going to talk about comparing what computed properties do versus what methods do, because a lot of people had questions about how there's a lot of overlap, and there is a lot of overlap. So I want to talk about why you would use a computed property over a method, or maybe a method over a computed property, because sometimes they seem like they do the same thing. The second part of this video, we're actually going to go into an example, and we're going to kind of rehash this example we did in the last video with how we set the first name and the last name to create a full name, all right? And the full name was the computed property. Well, now I want to reverse it and talk about how do we set the full name and then therefore be able to also set the first name and the last name by setting the full name, okay? So we're now setting the computed property instead of getting the computed property, all right? And we'll talk more about that in the second part. So that's what we're going to cover in this video, 2 more important concepts about computed properties. And when we're done with this video, we're actually going to be mostly done with the fundamentals of Vue.js. You'll know the basics, and we can now start diving into some real-world examples. And that's what we're going to be doing in the next video. We're actually going to jump in to a real-life example on using Vue.js and using many of the things we've been learning to actually create a small application, okay? So let's go ahead and dive into this video today and finish up learning about computed properties. All right, so the first thing I want to talk to you guys today about with computed properties is comparing computed properties to methods. What's the difference between the two? A lot of people had questions about this, and I think it's very, very astute for you guys to notice that. Now, let me just, for those of you guys that maybe don't see what we're talking about, let me just give you the example here so you can see kind of what other people were seeing and why there's so much overlap between what a method does and what a computed property does, okay? So if you guys want to open up the code I have for today, if you're already following along and you already have a folder on your computer with you cloned from Git, you can just go and do a Git pull to get the updated version from GitHub. If you don't have the code at all, just go down to the description below, down there, and you can download the code from GitHub, okay? It's absolutely free. All right, so now inside of the code, we have the same code that we finished off in part 8. If you went to part 8 and this end_name.html, this is basically the code we have with one small change. We're going to worry about this in the next part of the video, but I've basically added a second row here that has a input for our full name, okay? Because later on, we're going to type the full name and set the first name and last name. But for right now, don't worry about that, okay? Otherwise, it's the exact same code. Okay, so now if you come down to our Vue object down here, you can see we have the computed property and we have our full name. And the full name is a function that just returns the first name and the last name with a space in the middle to create that full name, right? Okay, so that's basically the project we have. And let's just real quick, I'm going to just head over to Chrome and I'll show you guys the example here. So we have our first name, right? We write John. And you can see as we type John, it updates the first name. We type Doe, and it updates the last name. And of course, we're also seeing the full name, which is right here, updating live as well, okay? Now, a lot of you guys were actually wondering, well, what's the difference between using a computed property like here and using a method? So up here, we call this computed property called full name, but we could also just create a method out of it, a method called full name, and we could basically just change computed to methods. Okay, and now we have a method called full name instead of a computed property. The method does the exact same thing. It's just a function that returns the first and the last name with a space in the middle. And if we actually come back over to our code now and refresh, and I do the same thing, John, you can see it sets the first name because this is the input is bound to the first name. This input is bound to the last name. And then of course this is just outputting the method called for full name. And it just does the exact same thing. It grabs the two names and puts a space in the middle. So you can see that we're getting the exact same result here, okay? So when we do full name as a method, we get the exact same result as when we had a computed property. So what's the difference between having a computed property and a method? And that's a very, very astute question that I wanted to talk about today. Okay, so now the biggest difference, well, really the only difference between the two is how Vue will cache computed properties, okay? So, for example, let's say that we set the first name, and that obviously as we set the first name, it's going to constantly update the value of full name, okay? As we set the last name, it also updates the value of full name. Similar, exact same way as the method. Now, where it varies is, let's say later on, we're going to create a new object in Vue and we need to grab that full name, but these two items haven't changed. Okay, we just need to get the full name again. Well, if we used a computed property, Vue.js will automatically cache computed properties. So it doesn't need to run this function again in order to get the full name. It just knows what the full name is. The only time it reruns this function is when the dependencies of this computed property change. In this case, first and last name are the dependencies for this computed property. So if first name and last name don't change, the value will always stay the same without needing to change the method, okay? Or without needing to rerun this function. Okay, and so that's the difference with computed properties. If you change this to a method, like up here, then every time we need to render this full name, it has to run the function, even if these two items haven't changed, okay? So that's the biggest difference between the two. Just keep that in mind. Computed properties are cached. And so in many of these ways, computed properties are generally the preferred way to go. Now, sometimes you might have some circumstance where you want to run the method every single time, and it's very possible that there's no dependencies or the dependencies haven't changed, in which case you may want a method. But most of the time, because computed properties are generally designed to be modified versions of certain dependencies like these objects right here, generally you want to use a computed property, and that way you don't need to re-render or rerun a function every time you get that property. Now, it might seem trivial in this example, and it is, but think about a more advanced example, something that has maybe much more code running in the function. If you didn't have to run that function every single time you got the property, then it would save a lot of computing power on the client's computer, and just make the whole application run a little more responsive. A bigger example would actually be if the computed property was the result of going out and doing an API call. Okay, and we're actually going to do this in the next video. The next video is a real life example where we use a computer in here, where we actually use a computed property, takes one of its dependencies, and then goes out to an API, gets a value from an API, and pulls it back and stores it in the computed property, okay? And in that case, it's actually very valuable to have this caching, okay? Because every time we want to get that computed property, unless the dependency has changed, every time we go to get the computed property, it doesn't need to run out and make another API call. It remembers the result. Okay, and so you don't need to go out and you can save on all of those API calls, which is very, very valuable. Imagine doing things like maybe searches or something like that, where you could be making millions of API calls a month. Saving, if you can save on a few keystrokes and you can save a few API calls for every single user, it could result in hundreds of thousands of saved API calls a month, and that could be huge. Okay, and so and it's just they're unnecessary API calls. So that's one example where hopefully it really makes sense that having computed properties being cached is very, very valuable. Now, you might have some circumstances where you want it to go out and check every single time, in which case you don't want the caching, and in that case you know to use a method and not a computed property, okay? So that's the difference between the two. You get the very similar result, it's true, but computed properties generally tend to be more flexible and more powerful, okay? Now, the second reason you might want to do it will just tie us right into part number 2 of this video, which is talking about getting and setting, okay? So one of the value of computed properties is the fact that they are set up to have getters and setters. And this getters and setters are a programming paradigm that exists in all languages. And it's basically when you have the value of a property, such as full name here, sometimes you just need to get the value of it, and sometimes you need to set the value of it, right? And this is a very common concept. And we usually call those getters and setters, or getter methods and setter methods, okay? And computed properties have the ability to set both a getter or to create both getter methods and setter methods. Now, by default, we only have getter methods. What we've been doing up to this point, this simplified interface right here, is basically showing the getter method for a computed property, okay? So in this case, this function right here is the getter method for the full name property, okay? And that's what you always have by default. And so every time we ask for the full name, it goes out and gets the value, or runs the getter method, okay? So let me just use this as an example. Let's go back up now to our new input that we have right here. We have our full name, and we've got an input for our full name. And let's go ahead and just like how we tied first and last name to each of these inputs, let's go do the same thing here. So we'll do vModel equals full name, okay? So we're now tying it to this computed property. Let's go ahead and save it, and let's go ahead and save and refresh. Looks like we have a problem. Let's take a look here. What did we do wrong? Okay, so it looks like our problem is up here. We have full name. It's not a method because we don't have a method anymore, so we need to get rid of those parentheses. So whenever you're working computed properties, you just treat it like a normal property, just like first name and last name. So you don't, and just like these, you don't need those parentheses, right? So that was the error. So let's go ahead and save this and just refresh. Now everything works. Okay, let's go ahead, just like we have in the past. Let's say James Smith. And as you see here, obviously everything worked the same as it did before. We had the value of first name, Smith, the last name change, the full name change. And because we bound this input to the full name model, it would automatically update as well inside of this input, right? So as we change these values, it obviously updates inside of here, okay? All of that's normal and expected, right? We've seen that before when we go down here into inspect, and let's say we grab vm.first equals John. What do we have here? Sorry, what's the name of it's app, sorry. Let's go back over here. Let's do app.first equals John. And you can see here now it automatically updates this, okay? So anyway, the point here is that you can see how all these are reactive. So the value of first name is bound to this input. So this is all very, very normal. Now what we're seeing here is the full name. Since full name is bound to this model, it's using the getter method, right? Full name is able to go out and get the value of full name and then return the value and put it into this input. Now, what happens if we change this? Well, as you can see, as we change the value of full name, nothing happens. And the reason for that is because what we're doing when we change the value of full name is we're trying to set the value of full name. And currently, computed properties by default can only get the value. You cannot set the value of a computed property. You can only get the value of it. It's a one-way type of property, okay? So down here, when we look at our computed properties, we have this property called full name, and it's only allowing us to get that. But that can all change by just setting or creating a set property as well. So let me show you how that works. Let's go ahead here, and we're going to open this up, and we're going to say get. And now we're setting this as a get function. Now we need to, let's see here. We need to create one extra parentheses. There we go. Okay, so now we have our get property. Let's indent this in here to make it easy to read. And this is now our getter. So let's go ahead here and say getter function. And this will work exactly the same way as before. The difference here now is we can also now create a setter function, right? So this is really cool. And we can now say set, and then this is the function that we want to run when we set a new property for full name, okay? And of course we pass in the value. This is the new value that we're setting full name equal to, and we can now work and modify that value, okay? So let's go ahead and set something. What we want to do is whenever we set the full name, we want to break it up, figure out what the first name is, figure out the last name is, and then set the first name equal to this first property and set the last name equal to the last property. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that. To do that, we're going to go ahead and create a variable called name, and we're going to set it equal to value. And remember, value, or whatever you pass this in, you can call it new name or full name or whatever. We're just going to call it value right now. It's a temporary object. So now we're going to set it equal to value dot split, and we're going to split it by a space. Okay, now this is just a JavaScript function, so hopefully you guys aren't, this makes a little bit of sense. What this function does, the split function, is it takes a string, finds this, what they call a needle, and then we'll split it based on this item right here. So in this case, it's space. So let's say you have a value called John Doe, right? What this function will do is it'll take, and it will set, obviously, all these into this name variable. So it'll create a variable called name, which is this, and this item will be an array. The first object in the array will be the first item on, that it finds before the split. So it would be, in this case, John. And then name, the second item, would be Doe in this case, okay? So John Doe, when you run split on it, would give you John as the first item and Doe as the last one, okay? So that's what's going on here. And we want to take this name 0 and set it equal to the first name, okay? So then first name will equal this value, and then last name would equal, this value. So these two would be the same. So that's what we're trying to do here. Okay, so now that we got that, name is now an array with the different items in it. And we can now set this dot first equal to name 0, just like that, okay? And then we can do this dot last equal to name 1, okay? And most of the time that should basically work. We basically just take that full name, take the first part of it before the first space, that'll be the first name, and we'll set it equal to this. This first property equal to that. And then the second thing after the space will be the last. Now there is one problem here. If someone puts in a middle name, it will actually set the last name to be the middle name, if that makes sense, because in this case, the last name might actually be name 2. If there's 3 words in there, name 2 would actually be the last name, if that makes sense. So how do we go around working around that? Well, what we can do is we can take, we'll take name dot length minus 1, okay? And so what that'll do is if there's 3 items in this name object, then it will grab the third one basically, which since it's a 0-based index, it'll grab the index of the length minus 1, which in this case would be 2, which is the third object. So hopefully that makes sense. All right, so we're gonna go ahead and save that. And now let's go ahead and just run this in the browser and see what happens. Okay, so obviously as we expected before, we do John Doe. And now John is equal to the first name. Doe is the last name as expected. And then the computed property, this is using the getter method to go get the value of the computed property, which just takes the first name and the last name and adds a space. Everything is working as before, right? Now what didn't work before is if we changed the last name. And as you can see here, as we change the value of full name, it's actually updating live the last name, and also the getter function still works for the full name. So it's setting the full name computed property, and in process of setting it, it also sets the dependency properties that we have, which is the last name and the first name. And as expected also, if we add a middle name, it basically just ignores it, right? And just takes that last name and sets it equal here, and then the first name, and sets the first name equal here, updates all of it, okay? So with very little code, we're actually seeing a lot of reactivity, and hopefully this makes a lot of sense for you guys. This is a very, very powerful concept where we can have this object here, this full name object, we can get it, we can get the property of it, we can set the property of it. It's all reactive. Whenever we set the value of full name, it automatically updates the first and the last name. Whenever these items get updated, it automatically updates the value of full name. And we have this crazy triangle of all sorts of awesome stuff going on with almost no code. We're getting all of this power with just this, okay? Which is so incredible that there's so little code going on here. This is such a simple code base for such an advanced concept. And that's one of the big, most powerful uses of Vue.js, okay? So hopefully you guys enjoyed that. That should sum up everything you need to know about computed properties. Computed properties are awesome, and they're extremely valuable for when you're working in Vue.js. Okay, so never forget, computed properties are cached, and computed properties also have the ability to create getters and setters. By default, if you don't create a getter and a setter, you'll just get a getter by default, but you can obviously break it out and have both getter and setter functions, okay? Now, hopefully you guys really enjoyed this video. The next video, we're actually gonna start diving into some real world examples. This is actually an example. I'm gonna be showing you an example of a real world project I did last week where I used Vue.js, and we created some reactive elements here where we basically take a value of an input from a user, and live, behind the scenes without a refresh, we use Vue to go out to an external API, use the input value from the user to go out to the API and get a response from the API and display that live back to the user, okay? So it's a really, really cool example. It's something that you guys can probably start using today. So anyway, that's what's coming up in the next video. Be sure to stay tuned for that. And if you haven't, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. And we've got a lot more videos like this coming up. So if you guys are looking for anything in particular, reach out to me on Twitter, or you can email me. All that information is in the description. And until then, I'll see you guys in the next video.